Oh, wow. Hi, everybody. Thanks for spending part of your Halloween with me. Seems like a totally appropriate topic for this, doesn't it? And it's kind of dark and almost kind of stormy, right? And I'm going to take you to some pretty dark places, some haunted places too. So I'm excited. I like this presentation a lot. It's not as dark and dreary as some of the other stuff that I do, which really is to walk on the dark side of humanity. And there's no place I'd rather be spending my Halloween than here with you, Howell Library, Howell Carnegie Library, beautiful library. Had a chance to just take a look around the downtown before I came to the library. I noticed you have a cool courthouse here. I bet you any money. This is the Howell is the county seat of Livingston. I bet you any money there was an old jail there at one point in time. I kind of suspect it was in the back. Um, Usually, we would put these within walking distance of the courthouse, and usually it'd be the jail and the sheriff's residence all coupled into one. Not every county had one, but most of them did. I think it was in the backside, probably. More on that in a minute. This is the Jackson County Jail, by the way, and doesn't it look like a majestic edifice? Got its Victorian turret. I just inverted the image to make it look really creepy. I also wanted to introduce you to these five ladies here. Um, I don't know, ladies might not be the right term for them. They are in prison. This isn't in Michigan. This is Sing Sing Prison in New York. And I wanted to show this image to you for a reason. We're going to do a comparison a little bit later on. They don't look like they're very happy to be photographed. Um, Notice what they're wearing. The hems of these dresses go pretty much right down to the floor. Notice what they're doing with their arms too, like this, all doing this with their arms. That's more than just an attitude, right? I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go. Here's my table of contents. So I'm going to introduce you to three creepy places in Michigan history and county jails, Detroit House of Correction, and the Michigan State Prison. And then I'm also going to introduce these places to some of their most infamous inmates. I want to spend most of the time talking about the content tonight rather than myself, but I probably should say a few words. I'm a true crime author of 14 books, soon to be 17. I hail from the west side of Grand Rapids, and I've been on TV as a crime expert. I've been on the Travel Channel a couple of times, Mysteries of the Museum, and I'm going to be on the documentary. I think it's going to be airing any day, and I think it's going to be an investigation discovery. So I've been a few places. I've done a few things. I spend a lot of my time researching really old timey crimes, which I particularly enjoy. So I'm pretty much engrossed in a project at any given time because I'm obsessive. My wife says I have a dark side. That's how it manifests itself. Right now, I'm deep into the research and writing about a Black Widow style serial killer who used the men in her life as a piggy bank um, through the proxy of life insurance policies in which she needed some money. They tended to die premature deaths. And she got herself out of debt that way. Okay, back to the content now. This is the Mecosta County Jail in Big Rapids, Michigan. I believe this building is still there. So the first dark place that I'd like to introduce to you are county jails. Now, they look like fashionable houses. And if I didn't tell you this was the county jail and it didn't say at the top of the postcard, you might have a really hard time realizing that this is, in fact, a penal institution. You can't really even see the bars, can you? Now, what's interesting is that jails that were built from the period of 1890 to 1910, they all look alike. They look like fashionable residences with variations within that theme. And they all over the United States they built them this way. The reason for this is why they look like fashionable houses is because in the era that these were built, in that 20-year period of time, say 20, 30-year span of time, people were very interested in the dark side of their community, but they didn't want to admit that crime existed in their midst. So what they did is they tried to mask penal facilities by looking like fashionable safe. Sometimes they make it, and sometimes they undergo the wrecking ball. Your Livingston County one obviously didn't make it, but if you were to go down the highway this way and go into Charlotte, you'll find that the Eaton County courthouse looks just like yours, a little bit smaller, and right behind it is the sheriff's residence. The cell block was behind the sheriff's residence and was connected to it, but the cell block is no more. Just the sheriff's residence exists. All over the state of Michigan, all over the United States, you see these kind of county jails. Now, what they were used for was incarcerating prisoners who were in jail for breaking a city ordinance. Very minor crimes, like, for example, um, somebody gets caught opening up a tap on a fire hydrant to drink water against city ordinances all over the place. And the court would have, they'd go to police court for minor crimes, and they would be given a sentence. And the sentence would be something like a $5 fine or X number of days behind bars. If they couldn't pay the fine, they wound up inside the cell block. These weren't lifers. They were also small-time petty criminals. Now, the real serious crimes, those folks would be in county jails until their cases matriculated through the courts. If they were convicted, then they were sent to one of the big houses. For women, it was the Detroit House of Corrections, and for men, it was the state prisons at Jackson and then later Marquette. So you had various populations, and they would have had a small little section that they called the women's division. The sheriff and his wife and his family would have lived in the front part of the jail. There would be a communicating corridor, and it was pretty much expected that the sheriff's wife would cook the meals for the prisoner. These meals would be taken, usually a crock pot, through the communicating corridor into the cell block. Lots of talk about prisoners not liking the sheriff's wife's cooking, but they want to say anything, right? Now, if the sheriff was widowed, then the cooking responsibilities would fall to his oldest daughter, right? This is the Gratiot County Jail in Ithaca. Also, I don't think this one existed, but this one doesn't exist anymore. But you can see the bars on this one if you look very closely. So, laser pointer, you can see the bars right here in the tower. You can see the bars back here, and you actually have either an inmate or a turnkey, one of the guards. This is a smaller prison complex, smaller jail complex, but I suspect the cell block goes further in the back over here. Interestingly enough, these things wound up on postcards, which is kind of funny. Would you go to a place and send a postcard of a jail? But why I think the reason that is because some of the nicer looking structures in town were the jails because of how they were constructed. Look at this, is gorgeous. This one's Kalkaska, a little more plain than the Gratiot County. Same dynamic. You have the sheriff's residence here, and then you have the cell block in the back. The cell block's two-tiered, and you see the bars. If this place could talk, now this doesn't exist anymore, but if this place did, the walls could talk, it would tell you stories of inebriated lumberjacks, and one very interesting story about one of the most prolific female serial killers in United States history, a serial poisoner by the name of Mary Murphy McKnight, who I'll introduce to you in a bit. This is the sheriff's residence in Jackson. Same thing. The same sheriff would live with his family in the front, and then the cell block would be in the back. In this particular postcard, you don't even see the back of it all. It's just the facade. And here's my favorite. This is the Kent County Jail. Isn't it a majestic looking palatial type structure? Now this had to be a bigger building because it actually housed three separate groups of prisoners. It was prisoners doing short time for Kent County. It was prisoners doing short time for Ottawa County, which is adjacent to Kent County to the west, because they didn't have their own. And then because the Grand Rapids Police Department only had a single jail cell in its earliest days, this was also the police lockup. And then, of course, there were prisoners who were being tried for very serious crimes. There was Jenny Flood, the Black Widow, who I referenced earlier in the presentation, who liked to use men as piggy banks. And she was in the women's division on the second floor. There was a little old woman named California Smith, who was found guilty of who was being tried for manslaughter because she was an abortionist, and she lost a teenage patient to septicemia. And they used DNC style abortions back then, and they didn't clean the implement. So, like in the Civil War, they did a lot of amputations. The first soldier got the clean knife, and he probably made it. Second soldier got the one with the blood from the first soldier. The third one got the blade with the blood from the first two soldiers, and so on and so forth. By the time you get to that third guy, he's going to die inside a couple hours from septicemia or peritonitis. This happened with abortionists all the time. They inevitably lost somebody this way. And little California Smith was like 68 years old, and she whiled away her time when her trial was winding through the court system in this cell right here. And she was actually found guilty and convicted of second-degree murder, and the sentence was something around 15 years in prison at hard labor. And she didn't want to go to prison that long because she was afraid she was going to die behind bars, which is exactly what happened. Sheriff's residence in the front. You can see the deputies milling about. Another deputy milling about back over here. Now, because of the way these structures, because of the way the jail bars work, and I'll explain a little bit of that in a minute, these structures just simply were not escape-proof, despite what they said. They were actually prison escapes were very common. There was a case in this jail where you had two chicken thieves, and they weren't in for any, they were being tried, and they weren't up for any really serious punishment, but they just didn't want to go to prison. So they did is they cut their way out of their cell block. They knitted their bed sheets together, and they shimmied down from that second story into freedom. Now, they were caught within a day or so. The prison, the county sheriff was a fellow named Loomis Bishop, and he tracked them down personally. But he was horrified that this happened on his watch, and so he really turned the screws on his team of deputies. So one rainy night, one of the night shift deputies hears something from outside of the cell block, and he's afraid that there's a prison break. It's a rainy night. So he goes out this door right here. Now, they always had two doors. Door for the sheriff's residence, door to the prison, to the cell block. He comes out this door in the rain, in his stocking feet, with a Winchester rifle. And he's looking to see if there's any bed sheets knotted together that are dribbling out of the second story. Doesn't see anything, so he runs all the way around the jail. Still doesn't find anybody. It's just something that he had heard, right? But what he forgot to account for is that this door, for security purposes, was on a spring, and the door shut and locked behind him. So soaking wet, he had to go wake up Bishop, who was not very happy about being woken up out of his beauty sleep, to let his own deputy back inside. Okay, that is the county jail that held the infamous Michigan Borgia. The infamous Michigan Borgia is named Mary Murphy McKnight, who did her thing in Fife Lake in 1903. I don't have a picture. I don't have a photograph of her. I only have these two newspapers. This is a photograph on the left-hand side from a newspaper, and the right-hand side is a sketch. Now, Mary is a really, really interesting individual. I wrote a whole book about her called Michigan Strychnine Saint. And I'll explain to you why they called it that in a minute, but it's going to sound like a funny nursery rhyme. But everywhere that Mary went, she left bodies in her wake. Not one, not two, not three, all five of her own children. Her first husband, who died after she fed him a meal, fed him rhubarb pie. So she moved in with a friend of the family, a guy named Ernest McKnight, who was married. And Mary's job, the agreement had is she could live with the McKnights as long as she made the meals, right? Uh-oh, bad call. Mrs. McKnight became sick and died almost immediately. And then she married Ernest, who became sick and died almost immediately. She cashed in on the life insurance policies of both that husbands. There were others. There was little Dorothy Jensen, who Mary babysat. She died unexpectedly. Then there was Mary's 19-year-old sister, Sarah, who died after Mary served her a cup of tea. You feel in a theme here, you don't want to eat or drink anything that this woman happens to serve up to you, right? Then we come to 1903 in the spring. Now, this is pioneer northern Michigan, right? It's all over northern Michigan. People are dying of natural diseases, natural causes, things like typhus, diphtheria, um, you name it, flu. So I don't know that there was a lot of suspicion about her until April of 1903. Then a very sinister sequence of events occurred. She was living in the farmhouse, her mother's farmhouse in Springfield Township, which is just on the Kalkaska County line side. It's about 100 yards from White Lake, which is Grand Traverse. She is in that house with her is her elderly mother, who's also a widow, her adult brother, John, his wife, Gertrude, and John and Gertrude's daughter, Ruth, who was just a baby Ruth. John, Gertrude, and Ruth were only living there until they could build their own farmhouse. So when the weather broke in April, John and Gertrude leave baby Ruth in the tender, loving care of dear Aunt Mary, and they go to work in the farmhouse. They come back for lunch. Mary has to break the news that little baby Ruth has perished in the upstairs bedroom of crib death, which is what we call SIDS today. You can imagine what this would do to the young mother. Right? John doesn't know what to do. Right? He's lost his only child. His wife is on the edge of a nervous breakdown. So he leaves his wife in the tender, loving care of her dear sister-in-law, Mary, when he goes to nearby Fife Lake to buy a coffin. The death records indicate that 1 hour has passed by. 1 hour has elapsed. And when John comes back to the farmhouse, Mary has to break the news to him that he has lost his wife in the same upstairs bedroom where they lost baby Ruth. This time, she had some type of seizure event. Mary reported a seizure event because she was with her when she died, and the family believed that she had epilepsy as a grand mal seizure. 10 days, Ruth goes into the ground in her mama's arms in the Springfield Township Cemetery next to Sarah Murphy, the 19-year-old sister who died after Mary served her that cup of tea. 10 days later, John is eating a meal served up to him by his dear sister Mary, and he has crippling stomach pains. And yep, you guessed it, he tries to go upstairs in the bedroom to sleep it off. This time, his mother, who's a very religious woman, is afraid there's a biblical curse on the family, literally. In the dead of night, no pun intended, she runs across the field to a nearby neighboring farm run by a guy named Battenfield. Battenfield was a really good friend of John Murphy. They knew each other since they were kids. Battenfield races back to the farmhouse, races up the staircase to that second-story bedroom just in time to see the last few seconds ebb away from his best friend's life. And he sees something really weird. And what he sees is going to be Mary McKnight's undoing, finally. He sees his friend wishbone backward, with the head on the bed and the feet on the floor, with his back so severely arched you can catch her arm underneath his spine. His eyes roll back, his lips roll back to reveal what is sometimes referred to as a grin in the eyes. And what I've just described to you is the telltale symptom of a strychnine overdose. What happens with the heavy metal strychnine is that when it overwhelms the brainstem, down base of your brain, it causes the central nervous system to malfunction. That malfunctioning central nervous system causes the back, the wishbone death. Now, there is only one other thing that will do this, and that is tetanus. But tetanus kills very slowly. Strychnine kills very quickly within hours. So if a poisoner like Mary is going to use strychnine, she's got to make sure there's no witnesses. And all the other people that she killed, the only person who saw the death was Mary herself, until Battenfield saw John Murphy. That triggered an exhumation of the wife and the daughter. The stomachs were put in ball jars. They were sent to the University of Michigan. They had a chemist there named Dr. Victor Vaughn, who was an expert in what we call toxicology today. Vaughn takes one look at the stomachs, and he says that there's, I think the quote was, enough strychnine to kill an elephant. Mary is taken to Kalkaska County Jail, where she is sweated out a confession, and she said that she killed all three of them, although she never meant to hurt, which is why I called her the strychnine saint. Um, Now, when this case, when it went to court, became national headline, they started to peel away the layers of Mary's onion, and they started to find all these bodies all over the place. Papers printed lists of possible deaths. 14, the number usually associated with her. Most of them children, most of them family members. My research indicates 11, but death records from that time are very, very sketchy, so it's impossible to know. So if you want to do a little dark tourism, here you go. You can find 4 of her victims lined up in a neat row in the Springfield Township Cemetery. There is Sarah, the 19-year-old sister. There was John, brother, and there's Gertrude, his wife. Gertrude is a twofer. In her arms is their daughter, baby Ruth, which was very common at the time to bury the mother and the child together like that. But they didn't put, I guess this was also common, although I don't know why, they didn't put the baby's name on the tombstone. She's there. I went and looked at the sexton. So next time you pass by that cemetery, you take a look at those headstones. Maybe you wonder, what dark secrets does this place have? Well, you know what? They have some really interesting. Not that you're probably going to want to go poking around the sexton's records of your local cemetery, but hey, you might want to. When I wrote the book, I came to know a lineal descendant of Mary McKnight, who is a friend of mine now. And we shared a lot, and she helped me put together a family tree. When I was researching the book, she was going through some family papers, and she discovered the Undertaker's bill. This is the Undertaker's bill for all 3 of the Murphys, John, Gertrude, and baby Ruth. And what's interesting is that in a small town like Fife Lake, Brower is the pharmacist and the undertaker. And he runs the grocery store, and he's got a granary. Okay. And what also is interesting is the prices here. Baby and casket for wife and child. I'm sorry. What is that word there? Something on casket for wife and child, right? Casket and services for John Murphy, which is more expensive. Digging the grave, $2. The livery team, which would be the horses to take the bodies to the graveyard, $2.50. They got more than the diggers. B.J. Knapp, the minister, got $5 for a grand total of $125. Interesting, isn't it? I don't see these documents too often. Oh, also, Brower sold fine tobacco and cigars, and fresh candies and nuts. I've never noticed that before. Okay, here's my favorite, the old Kent County jail, I showed you before. There's what it looked like after years had put kind of a dark coating on it from all the smog and such. I think this photograph's taken like in the 1930s. You can see some basic differences. You can see some differences in entrance right here. Looks like they put a secondary entrance right here. Police something or other. And it looks like they've taken this and made it functional rather than decorative. But the rest of the structure kind of looks the way it was. Now, unfortunately, this structure didn't survive. It underwent the wrecking ball in the late 1960s. At the same time, they took down the courthouse. And I was not alive back then, but I know it was very controversial. People didn't want that courthouse to be taken down. It's a really beautiful structure. But, progress, right? So anyways, you are looking at the 2 most infamous inmates in any Michigan prison. And they called the county jail their home while the state of Michigan figured out what to do with them. You are looking at the infamous Lonely Hearts killer, Raymond Fernandez, this fellow in the fedora, looking rather jumpy, and his partner in crime and in love, Martha Beck, who is being escorted by detectives to Grand Rapids Airport en route to LaGuardia because they're being extradited to New York. These 2, let's see what my next slide is, okay? These 2 used matrimonial advertisements and what they called Cupid Club or Lonely Hearts Club to meet lonely widows, and then they stole from them whenever they could. Whenever the widow became suspicious and was a threat to their plan, that widow disappeared, which happened in December of 1948 in New York, where Martha dispatched a 66-year-old widow with a ball-peen hammer. They took the body to a basement of a rented house where Fernandez cut a hole in the concrete, buried the body, and then finished the floor. Basically, he did such an expert job that even he had to tell the police where to go to look for the body, and then when they went to look for it, they couldn't find the seam in the concrete, so he had to actually direct them to where X marked the spot on the floor. Now, while that body of Janet Fay is growing cold, um, they had already established contact with a 28-year-old widow from Wyoming Township, which is a suburb of Grand Rapids where I grew up. And she had an 18-month-old toddler by the name of Renelle, a daughter. She was a widow. Her husband died in a truck accident. These two came calling in 1949. They deprived her of everything that she had. Then she and her daughter disappeared. Now, this Delphine Downing was very popular. People missed her. So the police arrived and caught these two red-handed. They were in the process of packing up everything of value that the widow had. The police went down to the basement, and what they found on the floor was a wet patch of plaster of Paris with a pipe sticking out of it. There shouldn't have been a pipe there. It's like somebody made it look like a plumbing job. They go down into the concrete. They find the body of Delphine Downing. They take these two to the jail, and they ask Fernandez, what did you guys do with the kid? Well, it turns out that Delphine Downing her husband was a veteran. And he had one of these military-style footlockers, one of these green boxes. Oh, I don't know. They're about this tall and maybe about this wide, right? So where GIs kept their stuff. Police officers had noticed that it was in the basement. They didn't think anything of it, so they shoved it to the side when they started digging in the patch of wet concrete. Fernandez tells them to look in the box. They go look in the box, and sure enough, there's the body of Renelle Downing. They'd killed both of them. They were caught. They had them so dead to right that they had really no other choice than to go along with the county prosecutor. And what he did is he offered them a deal. If they confessed to every crime that they committed, not just in Michigan, all over the place, he promised that those confessions would never leave the state of Michigan. And I think that McMahon, his name was, really was sincere in this. I think he wanted to fast track this case because McMahon knew that the death penalty was being voted on in Michigan's legislature. And I think he hated the death penalty. He was an avowed Catholic. And I think he wanted a quick closure because these type of cases are good on the resume. So Fernandez gets on the phone with the police in New York, and he tells them exactly where the body of Janet Fay is located. And that triggered an extradition battle between New York and Michigan for this pair. Meanwhile, the Betts-Warner electric chair bill fails, and Michigan doesn't have a death penalty. The county prosecutor made a promise that he could not keep. It wasn't his call. The governor of Michigan was being bombarded by extradition demands by Governor Dewey from New York. And the governor of Michigan did not want Michigan to become a haven state for people trying to escape the death penalty. So he made a deal with Dewey. He extradited these to New York. If they didn't get them on capital murder, they were to be sent right back to Michigan where they're going to be tried for both counts of murder here. So they were either going to go to Old Sparky in Sing Sing, or they were going to spend the rest of they were going to do 20 years of the possibility of parole in Michigan. Well, they got to New York. They were put on trial. They called it the trial of the century. They were found guilty, and they took the long walk to Sing Sing's electric chair in 1951. What makes this case really odd is that typically when a person is caught in a place, they are tried for the crimes they've committed in that place. They were caught for a double homicide here in Michigan, but they were sent to another state for an earlier crime. It happens, but it doesn't happen a lot. Here's Jenny Flood, shotgun slayer. Don't have a real good picture of her either. She was 1903 was kind of a rough year for Michigan women. I'm not going to lie. The year Mary McKnight did her thing. Now, Jenny Flood was the one I was telling you about who used the men in her life as piggy banks. She was living with two men. She was not romantically linked to either one of them, which caused all kinds of local tongues to wag. She was out in the farmhouse. See where this X is right here? This These steps lead to the kitchen um, of the house, and there's another exit entrance in the back. This X, okay, so note that Jenny and one of the gentlemen named Barney Fingleton were in the barn hitching up a horse when they heard a shotgun blast go off in the kitchen. They go into the kitchen and they discover, and this is a 1903 crime sketch, the other gentleman, John London, sitting at the dinner table eating his chicken dinner, right, with a big gaping hole in his head right here, and his brain slain on the floor by the I&T kitchen. This whole wall here was splattered with blood and bits of brain. The ceiling was splattered with blood and bits of brain and hair. And there were fleck marks in the plaster where it looked like the shot had gone up at an angle like this and buried or at least struck the ceiling. Now, there was some suspicion that maybe John London committed suicide, but that was quickly dispelled when they took the body to a local mortuary, opened up the jaws, and discovered that he had a half-chewed mouthful of chicken. The idea was he wouldn't have committed suicide whether he was mid-bite. He would have swallowed first or waited till he was done with his meal. Then that led to the possibility that it was an accidental death. This is what Jenny Flood told police, that he had a shotgun that had a hair trigger. He kept it with both hammers back, and he put it right where this X is right here. Now, he had a pet ferret, and his pet ferret was attacked by the neighboring dog. He vowed to get even with that dog. So Jenny believed that he had seen the dog coming through one of the windows. He grabbed for his rifle, and it went off accidentally, killing him instantly. However, if you get a visual here, sitting in a chair, right? The entrance wound is right here. The exit wound is right here. Entrance, smaller, exit, big gaping wound, right? Now, the way the wounds were positioned, it suggested that the rifle was on the horizontal, not like this. And the wounds, the blood and brain matter that was thrown against this wall, and the brain over here, it also suggests that the gun was placed at a near horizontal, and the trigger was pulled. Now, for John London to have accidentally shot himself, he would have had to reach back for the gun, and he couldn't have done this. He couldn't have reached back for the gun like this because the entrance wound would have been here. The entrance wound was here, which meant that he had to throw his arm back in a real awkward angle like this, grabbing the gun because he saw the dog walking by and he was going to shoot it, the dog that attacked his beloved ferret. But they estimated that the distance between where he's sitting and that X was 2 feet 9 inches. Well, they estimated the distance between the door jamb as 2 feet 9 inches and then another 9 inches inside where he kept his gun, where the X is. That means his reach has to be 3 feet 6 inches. He'd have to have stork-like arms to be able to have a reach like that. One of the taller police officers sat in that place, and he was a real tall guy, and he had long arms, and he couldn't even get close to the barrel. Well, one of the officers also was very suspicious of those flecks in the ceiling. They were too widely spaced to have caused from a shotgun blast at that distance. They also didn't look like pock marks from a shotgun. They looked like they were made with some type of, like a file or a knife. In the woodshed back here, they found two things. They found a bloodied axe, and they found a file. Now, there was a while when they thought that the bloodied axe was used to kill John London, and then his head was blown off to mask the crime, disguise the crime. The forensics didn't jive with that. But one of the officers got up on the table with the file and was able to fit the blade of the file into the fleck marks on the ceiling and concluded that someone had doctored the crime scene to make it look like the shot came from an upward angle. which means some of the shot would have hit above his head right here. That person had taken that file and jabbed into the ceiling. And some of the blood was missing. Some of the blood spatter pattern was interrupted, which means that the blood was already there when he or she started poking into the ceiling with the thing. But whoever did it did not understand shotgun forensics and made the pattern too wide. They start looking, and they discover that Jenny Flood had taken out a life insurance policy in the name of John London and named herself as a beneficiary. The handwriting on it was, the name was in John London, but the handwriting was Jenny's. The application was all done in Jenny's handwriting. The insurance agent said that she had been there and she had took the policy out on him, taken the policy out of him. When they asked her about this, she denied absolutely everything, right? It didn't matter anyways because she was in the barn with Fingleton when the gunshot went off. Then the police discovered that there was a life insurance policy in Fingleton's name that he knew nothing about that was also in her handwriting. They approached him about this, told him he was going to be the next victim, and he immediately changed his statement to the effect that he was in the barn by himself. He heard a shotgun go off. He went outside and he saw Jenny Flood emerge from the farmhouse, from the kitchen, along with wisps of black smoke from the gunshot. So she was in the kitchen when the gun went off. Leaves one problem. The whole kitchen was spattered with blood. There'd be blood everywhere. They looked at her clothes, no blood. So why would that be? The police believe that what she did is she fed him his last supper, so to speak, and she wedged herself behind the door jamb. She went into the pantry to get something. She took the gun, she put herself right here where the circle is, and inched the barrel closer and closer until it was near contact, and then pulled the trigger. After that, she took the file and she jabbed into the ceiling to try to make it look like shot had come up from a downward angle. The jury didn't believe it. They actually exhumed John London's head, and they put the head on display, and they tried to wire it back together. There were missing fragments. It was not uncommon in those days to use a body part and bring it in as evidence in a trial and actually put it on the evidence table for all to see. Really macabre, but it's kind of interesting. I don't think they would do that in a trial today. In fact, I know they wouldn't, right? But back then it was kind of regular to bring a body part in. So there John London's shattered skull is sitting, and they're talking about where the entrance to exit was. The jurors did not buy her explanation, and they sent her to prison for life at hard labor. Now, anybody who got a life sentence in Michigan was 20 years with the possibility of parole. It's not at all like it is today. Premeditated homicide today, never getting out. Back then, 20 years with the possibility of parole. And I can tell you that women never went the full 20. There was leniency for them in the system. They were almost always pardoned or paroled. Jenny Flood went in in 1903, and she was let out in 1916 in December. She was one of Governor Ferris's Christmas party. The governor was named Woodbridge Nathan Ferris of Ferris State University. And he broke a record in his last month of office, signing pardons of convicts. Maybe his pen ran out of ink. I've seen articles in newspapers where they published whole lists of them. Some of them were lifers, including the Black Widow serial killer, Jenny Flood, who, by the way, was living on the generous proceeds of a dead husband's life insurance policy. And he had died before his time under some very suspicious circumstances. People suspected poison, just like Mary McLean. Now, the people of Michigan were very upset about this because they felt like the governor, for political purposes, had wiped away a just verdict. Can't imagine a politician. Can you? But they did. Now, I can't show you, as much as I'd really like to, I can't show you what the interior of these jails look like. I've never seen a photograph. I think perhaps because the lighting wasn't good, and I think because they could not capture motion on camera back then. You find a photograph of the interior of an old jail, I'm your guy. Give me a call. Go looking in those trunks. foam in the attic. I don't think you're going to find them. So I've turned over a lot of stones looking for them. Just, and you can't go now because there are very few of these structures that actually exist. I do know Charlotte's got the sheriff's residence, but it's just a shell of it if it's once what it once was. I know that Allegan County has an old jail. They have some of the cells that are preserved. You can go in and you can go and look at what those cells are like. I haven't been there myself yet, but it's on the to-do list, on the bucket list. But by and large, these structures are gone and they're not even preserved in photographs. I can't even show you the interior of the old Detroit House of Corrections. I can show you one photograph of it. That's all I've ever seen. But I can do the next best thing. The company that made a lot of these jail cells was an iron firm out of Detroit by the name of E.T. Barnum. Not P.T. Barnum, Edward Barnum, no relation. And I got a hold of a Barnum jail catalog from about 1890. And we can see what the cells look like. And these sketches are amazingly detailed. You notice the bars aren't round? Okay. Here you have your corridor, and then you have your individual cells. It looks like it was a twofer. There were bunks. Notice they're hinged to the wall so they could be pushed up and out of the way when they weren't in use. They usually did interrogations right in the cells. See this right here, this little half moon thing? You know what that is? That's the toilet, right? You open up that thing and there's a little slop bucket in there. I've seen one for sale. I would love to buy it. It's E.T. Barnum on it. Black round, has got a lid. The seller wants $1,800. I'm like, I don't think so. But I've never seen another one. They're really over the top rare. Here's what a double cell block would have looked like. This has round bars. Again, here's one with the flat, they call these lattice style bars. There's another one. I've seen these actually for sale before. You know, the old cells that people took out of old jails. I was just speaking in Berrien Springs, which is Berrien County's county seat, and they have an old jail and the sheriff's residence, but they have a couple of cells. But the cells are out in the ground, open to the weather. So one day they'll be returned to the earth, quite literally. They're just going to be rusted away because it's a low-grade iron they used in these things. So kind of interesting they even have those things, though. Now, if you look very closely, the Barnum Company said that their jail cells were much harder to break through and cut out of because, in fact, you had to cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different places, push these out and crawl through. Whereas with single rolled bars, you only had to cut 2 to push through. So they said these were safe. However, these were made out of iron. I suppose these were too, but it was iron gives way to steel, which is harder and stronger. And it was not uncommon for inmates to have relatives come and visit them and smuggle in coils of wire. What they would do is they'd go immediately to work and they would cut through these bars. They would take soap and they would cover the scores up with the soap so they could hide the cuts until they were all the way through. And then when they were ready to make their midnight run, they just pushed their way out. Now today, we have telescoping bars, our prisons. So you have one bar nested inside of another bar, with another inside of that, and another inside of that. And then what they do is they pour liquid steel in the middle. You could cut all day long and you wouldn't get through. So our prisons have become, in theory, much more secure, although it wasn't long ago when there was an escape from Ionia. And Ionia is a 6. You know, most secure, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 6. I think those guys made it almost all the way to Grand Rapids before they captured them again. And you wonder how they could do this with the way the bars are. And I don't remember the details anymore. If I remember right, the DOC was kind of hush-hush about how they actually did it. I don't remember. All right, so here's the list of the towns where in 1890 they had put jails. This is really interesting. They did this internationally. You see they put one in the Philippines Islands and a bunch in Canada. But for our purposes, the line that's interesting here is this Michigan column right here. So Owasso, I'm going to be speaking there tomorrow, I think. Olivet, where my daughter goes to college. Pleasant. You see down here we have Cadillac, Cass City, Belding, So all of these places had county jails, and they all had jail cells or cell blocks that were put in by the E.T. Barnum Company. I put this image up on my website, Dark Corners of History. And I got contacted by some people in Wisconsin who were going to write an article for their historical society about their county jail. The jail didn't exist anymore, and they couldn't find any photographs. So they said they'd like to use the images from the jail cell catalog. Would I mind? Of course, I didn't. Kind of interesting. Now, for those people for those women like Mary McKnight who were confined in county jails but then found guilty, they were sent up to the big house. Now, for women, the only long-term facility for female inmates in the state of Michigan was the Detroit House of Correction. This is a creepy place. It's not there anymore. It's where the Greektown Casino was located. If you look at it's a southern Ward 4 on the eastern side of the city. If you look at old maps of this area, you'll see a cemetery there. And what the cemetery was people who died of a communicable disease. I think maybe like smallpox or diphtheria. Back then, it was considered so contagious they worried they could get it from the dead body. So what they did is they buried people of those who died from those communicable diseases. They buried them outside the city limits. Well, when the city got to be bigger and bigger, and they wanted to put a penitentiary in, they simply moved the cemetery. When this went under the wrecking ball in the 1930s, they found skeletons underneath it. And that, of course, led to all kinds of talk about people killed by the prison warden or ghosts or what have you. But in fact, what it really was is that they just simply didn't get all the bodies up. Okay? Now pause here for a minute. Indulge me in this anecdote. I live in Ottawa County, which is the west side of Grand Rapids. All right, the town is Genesee. We have a hidden cemetery. It's lost, actually. They were guys who died of, I want to say, typhus, and they were buried, and they had these tombstones. They were Dutch immigrants, and the tombstones were all in Dutch, right? So they were buried on the outside of the town limit, as was common back then. Somebody thought that the tombstones would make good paving stone, so they took them out. They laid them upside down, and they used them like flagstones to walk up, right? As the city grew outward, the location of that cemetery was lost. The stones are lost, and they were made out of limestone anyway, so being down in the soil like that, that'd be all worn down, the inscription. One tombstone exists in the local historical society in Dutch. That's it. The rest of the cemetery is gone. I think I know where it is. There's some properties that have a real deep backyard, and that would have been the edge of the old town. Someone's going to dig a pool back there someday, and aren't they going to get surprise of a lifetime? Okay, they're going to come across a whole bunch of skeletons from a lost cemetery. It's really fascinating. This is what this prison was big. It had two large 3-tiered wings, and then it formed a square with the yard in the back. This is a glass plate negative from the Detroit, one of the Detroit press. I think it's the Detroit Photograph Company. And anyways, in the Library of Congress, and you can expand this really large, and you can see somebody milling about here. But this guy right here is a guard, and he's got a shotgun over his shoulder. It's really clear when you expand it. The picture you're looking at is the only interior photograph I've ever seen of the old Detroit House of Correction. Notice the high arch windows? The structure was built before light bulbs, so they built the windows facing east with the idea that the sun would come in and provide natural light for the cell block. But this is Michigan, so who are we kidding? Don't exactly get sun for several months of the year. Am I going the wrong way? Okay. Oh, here's the outside of the cell block. See the high arch windows? We are standing in the west and we're standing in the east and facing west. This is one of the cell blocks. The other one is over this way. And then this would be the intake place and also the offices and the residence of the warden. Remember the photograph I began the presentation with, showing you the women of Sing Sing? Here's the Michigan version. I've only seen 3 photographs in this sequence, in one sequence only. 1899, the Biograph Company sent a crew over to the Detroit House of Corrections and caught them photographed them outside the cell block when they were being marched to dinner. Notice the dresses right down to the floor. This is the matron. Her name was Mrs. Brainerd. She was known as being a really tall woman. Notice what they're doing with their arms. Remember I told you that photograph at the very beginning with the women, they're standing like this? Something about when they walked, they had to walk like this. And I think it's because the prison wanted to make sure that they kept their hands to themselves. They were not permitted to talk. If they talked in public to one another, they got put in solitary confinement, and usually it was a standing sentence. They had to spend so many hours standing. Notice that our prison is the prisoners are integrated racially, right? The Detroit House of Corrections was the only prison of its time that I know of who did not practice racial segregation. We come back to that Sing Sing photograph of the white women, all right? In the background, if I showed you the whole expanded image, the background, you'd see the black women waiting to be photographed. Then there's another photograph in the sequence where you have the black women and the white women are in the back. They wouldn't even photograph them together, but our prisoners stood side by side. You'll notice also this woman here doesn't want to be photographed, and she's not happy about it. She can't say anything, so she's making a very provocatively naughty gesture to the cameraman, kind of thumbing her nose at the cameraman. To be like the middle finger back then. Fascinating, fascinating image. All of their sentences were at hard labor, which meant they worked in one of the prison industries to defray the cost of their upkeep. That's how they handled it. Now, the bread and butter industries of the Detroit House of Correction were carding buttons and putting cane backs on chairs. They're carding buttons here. They didn't manufacture the button. They just sewed them on the cards so they could be sold that way. Here's the button, and here they are sewing them on the card. Again, you wonder what these ladies would be saying. Would they be telling a joke or a rumor, gossiping, circulating rumor, maybe dreaming about what they're going to do when they get outside. But in reality, they're not saying anything. They have to follow the silence rule. Most of these women are in for drunk and disorderly. One of them was doing her 179th stint for drunk and disorderly because she liked to drink whiskey. That's 179 prison sentences for drunk and disorderly behavior. Really amazing. Here it is. Here's the whole female population of the Detroit House of Corrections, which means this is all the short timers in 1910 in Wayne County, in addition to all the long-term female inmates in the state. And this is an all-inclusive list, which just simply isn't very long. Not a lot of lifers. Most of these women are prostitutes or doing time for drunk and disorderly or violating one of the other city ordinances, like pulling a tap on Sunday, which is legal everywhere. But there are a few here that are lifers. Sarah Quimby, loveless marriage to a farmer named Elmer Quimby. She poisoned her 2 children and then tried to kill herself. She survived. The kids didn't. She got a life sentence. Nellie Pope, who engineered an assassination plot of her husband. I talked about Jenny Flood already. Corin Larson, her name was Corin. She and her husband, Ole, killed a handyman to collect on some life insurance money. Mary McKnight, who I talked about at length already. This is Nellie Pope right here. Okay, white, female, 50, widowed, Canada. Why she's widowed is because she widowed herself. Here's what she looked like when she was 28 years old, and here's what she looked like when she finally got out after doing 31 years, which is quite rare for a woman to do that much time in Michigan. I think that this is the house's most dangerous prisoner. That's really saying something. She was married to an older dentist by the name of Dr. Horace Pope, who did his drilling from the front parlor of the Woodward Avenue residence. They had one child together, a daughter named Bernice. Now, the dentist was busy drilling. Nellie had picked up 2 very bad habits. One is she acquired a love of opium products. Back then, you could get opium over the counter, laudanum, headache medicine, paregoric, tincture of opium, morphine, cocaine, killer curia. You get whatever you wanted in those pharmacies back then. And this led to people being addicted to this stuff, and they called them opium eaters, right? So you know how this works, right? Somebody has a headache, goes off to the pharmacy says, here, take some tincture of opium. That takes care of the headache, and boy, does it feel good, right? The next day, she doesn't have a headache, but maybe she's a little stressed out, so she takes some more of that tincture of opium. Man, it feels good. One day turns into another, turns into another, turns into another. Before you know it, she gets a headache if she doesn't take it. Now she's got a full-blown addiction to it. This was very, very common. The other habit that she picked up that her dentist husband knew nothing about was an affair with a local barber, a younger barber named Billy Brousseau, who also shared her love of opium. She was so persuasive that she convinced her husband to let her lover move in with them on the guise that she needed help around the house. The dentist wound up spending the night in a chair in the kitchen. She sent Billy all over town to the pharmacies to get their dope. Meanwhile, she took out several very large life insurance policies in her husband's name. Now, you know what's coming. Quite literally, on a dark and stormy night, she lures the husband, Horace, into the bedroom. Behind the door is Billy with an axe. As soon as the dentist gets in the room, Billy hits him, whoops him in the backside of the head with an axe so hard it takes the top of his head off, scalps him. Then Billy, who's high at the time, makes his critical error. They always make one critical error. He took the axe and he set it against the wall. Now, Nellie had scripted the whole plan. She, like a director, directing all of the action. She had scripted it. And that all this was on script, except putting the axe against the wall. He goes off to find the nearest police officer, and he tells the police officer that the dentist caught him in flagrante delicto with his wife. The dentist took a shot at him, missed. He was cutting wood for Nellie at the time. He had an axe in his hand, and he slammed the dentist in the forehead with the axe and killed him. When the police came to investigate, and they took a look at the dentist, and he's got a wedge of hair in the back. He's bald everywhere except in the back. Half moon wedge of hair. They take a look at the axe, and it's got coagulated blood and hair on it. So that was all the evidence they needed to prove that Billy hit the dentist in the back of the head, not in the front. There went the self-defense story. So they do something that police officers would not do today, and they withhold Billy's drugs, and they tell him, look, you tell us the truth, and we'll give you your drug. So he tells them, they give him the drugs. They publish transcripts of his various statements, and he is all over the place. You can just see him climbing up the walls until they give him his drug. He turns state's evidence on Nellie. He gets a life sentence anyways, and she goes down to life in prison. Now, so a very interesting thing happened to her. It happened during the trial. She had this daughter, Bernice, the little kid, 5, 6 years old. Supposedly, Nellie taught Bernice how to cry on cue. The juries in 1895 would have been all men, right? And so when there's a particularly damning piece of testimony, Nellie nods to Bernice, and Bernice starts bawling. This is the ultimate piece of visual rhetoric for the jury, who look at the crying little girl and have to be thinking, if we put the mother in prison, what's going to happen to the kid? Excuse me. It doesn't work. Nellie goes to prison for life. Excuse me. Now, behind bars, she is an absolute hellion. She sees ghosts. She goes to the warden, and she tells the warden she's seeing ghosts, and he gets so tired of hearing this refrain from her that she's haunted, that he tells her, if I did what you did, I'd see ghosts too. I would be haunted. She refuses to follow the silence rule. She does numerous stints in solitary confinement. The one Nellie Pope story that I love more than any other is during a church service on Sunday. They had a chapel in the prison. The men worshiped for the ground level, and the women, since there were fewer of them, worshiped from the balcony. Without any warning, without any provocation, she flung herself over the railing on top of the men below. All 6'4" of her. I don't know if I mentioned she was 6'4". They called her a statuesque beauty. That, in essence, is Nellie Pope. And she was so bad behind bars, she beat up other inmates, got into scuffles, that they didn't let her out early, like a lot of the women who were doing life sentences. So she actually didn't get out until she was ripe old age. One other thing about the Detroit House of Corrections, which is kind of fascinating, is that in its earliest days, it held another population, and that population was prisoners who were coming in from the Western Territory. These prisoners were guilty of all kinds of different things. This fellow here was guilty of murder, and his sentence, he was sentenced to hang, and his sentence was commuted, and he was sent to the Detroit House of Corrections until they built Leavenworth Prison in Kansas, and they transferred the federal prisoners there. Now, when the prison went under the wrecking ball, this document was found. This is to the active warden at the time, a guy named Borgman. And this is a notice from George Hand, acting governor of Dakota Territory, notifying him that this incoming inmate is under a suspended sentence of death. This is an interesting side note. So our state had a real connection to the Wild West. And if you like the show True Grit, you've seen the movie or read the novel, both True Grits, the John Wayne and the Jeff Bridges version, have a very prominent mention of the Detroit House of Corrections. And Rooster Cogburn threatens one of the suspects if he doesn't behave. He's going to wind up in the Detroit House of Corrections. And he makes some kind of comment like, they'll teach you how to read, but you're going to do some really hard time. It's a very, very hard place. So I wrote an article about this in Michigan History Magazine. It came out not long ago. It was called When the Wild West Came to Detroit. And it came in the form of some real bandits. And what they did is the sheriffs came off the territory, the marshals. They were handcuffed to their prisoner. Came off the train, walked them to the Detroit House of Corrections, went back to the train, went back to the territory. Sam and Belle Starr, infamous bandits, Wild West, were put into Hoco for horse theft. And they were lucky they weren't hanged, because they hanged horse thieves a lot of times in the Western Territory. When we come to the last creepy place, this is the old Michigan State Prison in Jackson. It's now, I think, part of it is a condominium complex. I think the isolation cells in the basement are still there. You can go there. There are some really interesting ghost stories attached to that. It's the largest walled prison in the world. Cell blocks came out this way. There was a rotunda in the middle. And then this was the warden's residence. And then the other cell block came this way. Then the whole prison formed a block in the back. Here's a bird's eye view. Here's the cell block. Here's the cell block. Here's that rotunda. Here's the warden's residence. This is the wall, making it the largest walled prison in the world. And all these buildings here are the prison industry. Michigan essentially sold slave labor. It sold out their inmates as slave labor. It would never be allowed today. But every sentence, male and female, was written X number of years at hard labor. And they justified selling the labor by saying that they needed to defray the cost of their upkeep. But in reality, what they were doing is they're selling off really, really cheap slave labor. The single biggest user of it in the late 1880s was the Jackson Wagon Company that made forms of transportation, carriages and wagons before the car. And the second one, I bet you have no idea what this is an advertising card for. Take a guess. You had a guess. Dress. Good guess. Any other? Would you be surprised if I told you that this was a shoe advertisement? It is a shoe. The second largest user of prison inmate labor was a Chicago manufacturer of women's shoes. The women's shoes were made by male inmates in Jackson because they didn't have a female population. They were incarcerated in Detroit. Notice that you don't have a shoe on here. You have something that's a whole lot more pleasing to the eye. You have a woman in a dangerously low-cut dress. that would be considered very provocative at her age. Why? Because in the 1880s, just as now, sex sells. You have to flip it over to see that there's a shoe advertisement. Really interesting. Here's what the cell block looked like. Again, this prison was constructed before light bulbs. Then when they did electrify it, they put a single incandescent light bulb into the back of screwed into the back of the cell. Here are inmates at rest with the prison industries behind them, milling about in kind of a cool uniform. I think this picture was taken sometime in around 1893. Now, the warden in 1893 was a real prison reformer, and today he would be celebrated as such, as a visionary. But in 1893, he was considered too loose, and there were all kinds of prison escapes on his watch. Now, the reason why he was so lenient is because he was replacing a warden who was fired by the state of Michigan for being too tyrannical. He was sadistic, meted out all kinds of punishment. Do you know they actually had a whipping post where they tied guys to them and they flogged them? So when this warden came in, he decided instead of giving them literal physical stripes, he would color code them with clothing. It's a really interesting idea. So what he did is every prisoner that came in, he had a meeting with, and then he gave them a number based on how much of a security threat he felt they were. Then they all got their prison uniforms with stripes. If they behaved, they could trade in their stripes and they could get this gray flannel. If they tried to escape or misbehave, they got right back in their stripes. So instead of whipping them and giving them physical stripes, he gave them striped clothing. This is brilliant because the guards along the wall would be able to instantly tell who the escape risks were because they would be in striped clothing. Unless, of course, they swapped clothes. You're looking at a man, we've never had a death penalty in the state of Michigan. The last person legally hanged, not lynched, but legally hanged, took place before state. Bar owner who beat his wife to death in Detroit. Well, just because we don't have a death penalty for state crimes doesn't mean that it isn't debated from time to time. In the history of the state of Michigan, some have come up like 50 times. And it's usually triggered by a very, very public, very messy crime or a crime wave. This fellow here was such a piece of work that he influenced three votes to bring in an electric chair, to bring a death penalty to Michigan. 2 of the 3 attempts passed the House, but narrowly failed in the Senate. So what was he all about? He was a pharmacist who liked to get high on his own supply. He owed money all over town. His biggest creditor was his mother, who was going to cut him off. Unsurprisingly, she wound up dead, beaten to death in her bedroom. He had set up what he thought was the perfect alibi, but it fell apart under scrutiny, and he was tried for the crime of matricide, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison. Now, his entrance into the prison system coincided with this new, loose, reform-minded warden. And the warden wasn't for wasting people's talents. He figured this guy's a pharmacist, let him work in the pharmacy for the prison. Bad call. They let him bring in what drugs he wanted to. And he brought in cyanide, and he mixed up a batch of poison lemonade to try to poison off the guard so he could get away. Now, it wasn't designed to kill anybody. He said he used himself as a guinea pig and created watered-down batches of cyanide-laced lemonade just to knock out the keepers. But the first keeper he dosed was an old guy with a weak heart. It killed him. So this led to another attempt to bring in a death penalty to the state of Michigan. This one was aimed at any prisoner who was doing life sentence who killed a prisoner. Now, the proposal called for 3 forms of the death penalty. One was hanging, which was common all over the United States in 1893. The second one was the electric chair, which was new technology. The third one was what they called decollation. Decollation is beheading, which I can only think to mean they were going to bring a guillotine and put it in the prison. Or a guy with a really big, wicked-looking blade. Now, once the Michigan matricide, as they called him, settled down to a life behind bars, he took up a hobby that nobody really knew about. This is one of the most fascinating things about any crime I've researched. If you go and you go to ancestry.com, genealogy bank, or newspapers.com, and you type in the name Ashford Ames in quotation marks, you're going to find these short stories appearing all over the United States in newspapers, including this one, A Horse on the Governor by Ashford Ames. See the name? And this is the San Francisco Call, I think is the one. And it's a whole page with art. All of Ashford Ames' stories have a prison break theme. That's because Ashford Ames was in reality Robert Irving Latimer, who's doing life in prison for killing his mother. No one knew this, of course. They knew the author Ashford Ames. No one knew that it was, in fact, a lifer in Michigan State Penitentiary. Unlike a lot of other prisoners, prisoner 4578 was not paroled for a long, long time. He was the longest tenured prisoner in Michigan State history. He had spent over 45 years in prison when they finally did let him out. They pardoned him. He wound up spending his nights on a park bench in downtown Detroit. He was delusionary, so they put him in Eloise Courthouse where he died. He was brought back to Jackson, buried next to his mother, who he killed. Now, in the 1930s, early 1930s, the old Jackson Penitentiary was too old and too worn down, so they built a new one, which is where it is right now. They transferred every inmate to that new prison except for him, the last inmate, and he earned for him yet another nickname. The Michigan Matricide, a.k.a. Ashford Ames, had now become the warden of the old prison. And he had the run of the place. There were no bars holding him back. There were no guards. I guess he was very fond of the gardening around the prison. I often wonder in this age, this time of his life, whether he didn't wander over to the house where he beat his mother to death, or over to visit her grave, or over past his West End pharmacy where he was making a pretty good living. I went to visit Jackson. In the house where he killed his mother, she was running for the windows to try to call for help, grabbed her from behind, and he battered her to death. You could see the windows. The house is still there. Looks just like it did back in 1893. And you can see the windows she had made a feline, okay? Standing at that spot. You look this way, you can see where the prison was. You look this way, you can see where the cemetery where his parents are buried. The West End pharmacies are over here. These places are all geographically in a very small area. So I often wonder in this time of his life whether he wandered around town and looked around. Kind of interesting. There's the governor letting him out. He's on the left-hand side. Okay. Oops. I don't have copies of this here with me, but it is one of my latest publications, came out last year. And I will take you into some of the weirdest unsolved cases in Michigan history. He's already at a bookstore near you. This is my biography of Amos Lunt, first executioner of California San Quentin Prison. If you want to know all about the 20 bandits of the Wild West that he executed and how he did it, check out the book. I do have a couple copies of this. Interesting guy. He dispatched 20 of the wildest bandits of the Wild West, and then they started to visit him in his nightmare. Here's a presentation that I'm scheduling right now. So if you like the presentation tonight, maybe you'd like to meet these people. Here I am in an old territorial jail in Floride, Arizona. It was 98 degrees that day when we visited. I was on an anniversary trip. And I guess when you're married to somebody for 20 years, you just feel like throwing them behind bars. I like to hear. Actually, a little freaked out that there are going to be some rattlesnakes in there. I speak like this all of the time, all over the state. I'm coming to the end of my season of my lecture series for 2023. I have 2 this week. I have 3 next week. I come down to Southeast Michigan a lot, so presentations are usually at libraries, usually for free. There's all kinds of them, different types of presentations. So if you enjoyed the presentation and you want to join me on another walk to the dark side, check out my schedule. I might be coming to a library near you. Now, positive word of mouth is my very best advertisement. So if you like the presentation this evening, please talk to my friends here at Howell Library. I've been here multiple times. I love it here. um, ask them to have me back, or other libraries in your area who might like to host me. I'm a pretty cheap date. If you didn't like the presentation, don't say anything to anybody. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So, um, hour and 15 minutes. I think I'm basically right within my time frame. The extra, I really appreciate the extra 15 minutes because if you haven't been able to tell, I got my mama's gift of gab. So, take a few minutes to answer whatever questions you might have, and then if you're interested in the book, $20 each, cash, check, or PayPal. I'll sign them every way you want. No pressure, though. I'm not here to sell you a book, but I do bring those in case you want to take a look at it. Okay. So, any questions? All for me. Yes, ma'am. No, the old Dahoko transferred its entire population over to the new one in Plymouth Township in 1926. The one in Plymouth Township, I think, is I think it's part in Plymouth and I think it's part in Northville Township. And yeah, so what it was is it was a prison farm and a male and a female population. And it was the only long-term facility to hold female inmates in the state of Michigan until they closed that one and opened up the Robert Scott Correctional Facility. Now, what's interesting is that um, in Michigan, you see that things kind of go in cycles, right? So with prison, so you see a really bad situation for prisoners, then the next situation is usually better. You have a sadistic warden, the next one's a prison reformer. The Holco things were, it was a dungeon for women. They were not allowed access to the yard, which meant that they were either in their cells or working at the in the prison industry. It was overflowing. They had women sleeping on cots outside the cells. So this wasn't at all a decent arrangement. I think it was dirty. It was disease. So when they built the new one out in Plymouth Township, they reacted to this. They hired this guy named Albert Kahn, a very famous Detroit area architect, to build structures within the prison farm for the women. They looked, I have a picture of them someplace. They looked and functioned just like a college dormitory. You look at them and they look like small townhouses. You'd never know to look at them that you're looking at a prison, right? And the women not only were allowed outside of their building, but they were allowed free access to the prison farm as well. They were allowed to do things like garden because it was so draconian in downtown Detroit. It became easier in Plymouth. So when you were growing up, the prison that you're talking about would have been in Plymouth Township, which isn't there anymore either. So, and then either there's Robert Scott. That one gave way to the Huron Valley Women's Prison, which I think is in Ypsilanti. So, yeah. When you were growing up in the 1940s, it sounded like one of the Dehoko's wickedest women was a woman who was married to a guy who had a zipper problem. All right. He just is a ladies' man. And she would not share him with anybody. So she fed him some wine that was dosed with a soporific to put him to sleep. And then she garroted him to death, strangled him to death with a clothesline. And then she sat down and did the crossword puzzle. And then when she was done with the nap, she dismembered the body with a butcher's knife. She had medical texts that she was reading to figure out how to actually where to cut the joints. She wrapped the body parts with newspaper, and then she put them in her car. She was from Kentucky, and she was going to drive and bury the head in a cave, and she was going to strew the body parts alongside the road. And a funny thing happened. The car broke down outside of Toledo. It was towed to a garage, and it was in the middle of the night. They couldn't get to the car till the next day. They told her to go check in the hotel. She refused to leave the car. She slept there. She even took a meal there. When one of the mechanics asked what was in the wrapping, she said, "Dear me, it was venison." Now she fell asleep ultimately. And one of the mechanics got nosy. He poked and he opened up one of the papers and found a leg. The police were called, and Nina Housden, her name was brought back to Detroit and sentenced to life in prison. I give a presentation in Northville. It seems like I get invited there quite a bit. So I was given a presentation on the Dehoko, and a woman showed up, and she was a matron in that prison, and she knew Nina Housden personally. Nina was really beautiful. I mean, she's really, really good. Excuse me, really good looking. And she was from Kentucky and spoke with a slight drawl. And she said that even in her advanced years, She was very, very good looking, very quiet. Spoke with that slight accent. People had a hard time believing that she had it in her to kill and dismember, but she did. It's a fascinating story. It'll be my next book called Killer Women of Michigan. None of you ladies are in that one. I could be a sequel, though. So what other questions can I answer for you? Have a wonderful Halloween. And it's been a pleasure speaking to you this evening. And I hope to see you all again. Thank you very much. Thank you.